Well, one of Ukraine's concerns from the start of the war was that its largely united Western allies would eventually feel war fatigue, a certain acknowledgement then that resources and political support for funding Kyiv's resistance are not unlimited. Well, nearly a year into the conflict, there's still no sign of Western solidarity letting up. France, Germany, and the U.S. all announcing a new wave of military aid this week. But what about support for the Kremlin? How close are its allies? And what is Moscow doing to boost its image abroad in the face of unwavering Western support for Ukraine? For more, Dr. Samuel Ramani joins me now for perspective. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Well,
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
I'd like to start by assessing Russia's status on the world stage nearly a year into the war. Just how isolated do you think the Kremlin is now?
Well, I think isolation is a bit of a subjective term. Obviously, Russia is more isolated than it's ever been in the post-Cold War era from the collective West, which it defines as the United States, Canada, Australia, Europe, as well as some core Asian allies of the United States like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. But elsewhere, it's maintaining largely business-as-usual relationships. The collective non-West in general has refused to impose sanctions on Russia, but it's still unclear whether the momentum that Russia had over the course of the past decade in terms of expanding its economic and defense partnerships in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Indo-Pacific in particular, will be able to sustain, because Russia, let's face it, is not a very appealing investment destination or is really seen as a growth economy or a strong military anymore.
So we've seen the form that Western support takes for Ukraine. It's not only development aid, political support, media support, but also weapons, of course. So for Moscow, who are its closest allies and what does that support look like concretely?
Well, in terms of military support, Russia's always had this long-standing tradition of self-sufficiency in the military sphere. It's always seen itself as an arms exporter, an arms supplier, rather than a country that's had to rely on other countries to help itself militarily. Obviously, during the Soviet era, it had a network of satellites in the Warsaw Pact, like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, that would do its bidding and act as surrogates. Right now, most of its allies in the post-Soviet space have done nothing, and their only real partner is Belarus, which has allowed for their territory to be used for missile strikes, has also supplied ammunition to the Russian military. Further afield, outside of Eurasia, we've been looking at Iran in the military sphere, obviously, with the supply of drones, though they're not yet giving missiles, and perhaps North Korea, according to the United States, which has been providing some rockets to the Wagner Group, the mercenary organization. Economically, of course, they're now more dependent than ever on China, which and also other countries like India, which have greatly increased their fuel purchases from Russia.
So you say that it's got economic reliance on places like China and India. What is preventing those two pretty major world powers from offering more overt forms of aid to the Kremlin then?
Well, China has been very careful about not wanting to get involved in this war. I mean, obviously, China has tried to present itself as some kind of a peacemaker. It adopted many of Russia's narratives. Like, for example, it's accused the West, of a NATO expansion of being one of the major causes for the war, and it's also used its media outlets to raise questions about Russian war crimes and some of Russia's most egregious conduct. But China has never supported the invasion outright, so that's why it's probably not wanting to get involved militarily. India also, it wants to present itself as a voice of de-escalation, but ultimately the future of Indian foreign policy and the future of India as a regional power in the Indo-Pacific and a potential great power in the world stage depends on having strong relations with the United States. So it's really important that India maintains those ties to the West. So Russia's useful for these countries because they can supply arms and fuel, but they're not really a country that they really want to invest in or form a real alliance with.
To change gears a bit, you contributed an essay to the 2022 IISS strategic survey on Russia's military activity in Africa. In recent months and years, we've seen the Kremlin step up its presence across the continent, notably in Mali and the Central African Republic. Do you think that the Kremlin has an interest in trying to obtain, or at least portray itself as obtaining victories on the African continent, so to speak, as it falters in Ukraine?
Well, Russia certainly defied expectations by not withdrawing large contingents of troops from Africa. there was a lot of concern, particularly after some Wagner Group mercenaries from the Central African Republic relocated to Donbass in late January, so a month before the war began, that Russia's positions overseas, if their military and manpower situation diminished, would be withdrawn. Now, that hasn't happened. They've sent additional helicopters and they maintained their contingent of around 1,000 forces in Libya. They maintained their in Mali. They maintained their contingent of around 2,000 forces in Libya. And they've also, largely after that initial drawdown, kept their presence in CAR. But the problem is, they haven't been achieving victories in Africa either before this war or during this war. They failed in countering terrorism in Mozambique very spectacularly when ISIS cut off the heads of 7 Russian forces. They lost in Libya to Turkey's counteroffensive. And in Mali, they've not even been able to take over the largest gold mine, let alone do anything to quell the insurgency. And the loss of French aerial support has really made their security situation there worse. So I think that Russia has failed in Africa, just like the way it's failed in Ukraine, because of bad relations between the Russian military and local proxies and surrogates, and just general problems with the command structure and combat techniques that Russia uses. It's too rigid and doesn't adapt to new terrains and changing circumstances anywhere near as effectively as they should.
Do you think they're able to frame their presence in Africa perhaps as a diplomatic victory, notably against countries like France, who have kind of been forced in the face of the presence of Wagner mercenaries to withdraw from several former colonies? And if so, do you think that represents a reflection of failed French diplomacy?
Well, Russia certainly is going to frame whatever it can as a victory. So even if it doesn't achieve anything in terms of counterterrorism, and all it's really able to do is support autocracies and kind of act as like, the defender of autocracies across the world, if view the withdrawal of France from those countries as a sign that the people have somehow been fed up with French neocolonialism, and they now are embracing these juntas and these autocracies, and Russia's supporting the will of the people inside Africa. So that's how they're framing it. They're framing their support for authoritarian regimes as some kind of a populist measure, and they're hoping to convince people in Africa and large sections of the global south of the validity of these claims, as well as their own domestic audience. And it seems to have worked with some of the sporadic protests that we see in Burkina Faso, for example, which show pro-Russian movements. But I think in the long run, that kind of a farce is going to be exposed if Russia's just stealing mineral resources and supporting autocrats and not improving the security situation. It's very hard to maintain a credible narrative about that internationally for very long.
Samuel Ramani, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for coming on France 24 again, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Great to be here. We look forward to speaking again soon as well.